Hello, it's Miss Rose here, Head Librarian at King's for those of you I haven't met. Today I'll be demonstrating how you can use the critical thinking model in research, and I'm using my background in art history for this. So you'll also get to learn a lot about an artwork through the process. Let's just recap the basics of critical thinking. If you break critical thinking down, it's simply a three-part process, and with this we're talking about describing the artwork, analysing how it came to be, and evaluating the relevance and significance of what you've examined. At the description stage of thinking about what you're researching, you might ask questions like what, where, why, and who to establish background and context. If you're considering a painting, you might ask questions such as who created this? When was it painted? These are important questions to start with, but you're not adding anything of your own to our understanding of that painting in answering those questions. Description sets the scene, and importantly, it provides the evidence for the more useful parts of your work that will get you marks in an exam or an essay, which is the analysis and evaluation stages of questioning. In the analysis stage, you look at what you've got and you ask why it looks that way, why not another way? In the evaluation stage, you ask, so what? A great old work of art has stood the test of time. It must have been significant in its day, it must have had relevance or value to its audience, and it must have continued to be significant through the years when it was no longer new or novel. And for us to still be talking about it today, it must still speak to us in some way. So you should define what makes it interesting to you, looking at it now in a very different age and context to when it was intended to communicate its message. If it still speaks to you, why? So let's take a look at how this works in practice. You may find it helpful here to have a visual of this critical thinking process with you while we work through the other slides. This is the Farnese Gallery in Rome, a long room in the palace belonging to the Farnese family. This is what I'll be applying critical thinking to today to show you how it works in practice. Now, this is a really complicated artwork, but if we apply a simple critical formula to how we approach the work and investigate what's going on, we have a really solid framework to build a rigorous analysis upon. The gallery is decorated with artworks from the Farnese family collection, and the walls and vaulted ceiling are painted illusionistically by the Carracci family of artists and their helpers between 1598 and 1604. And there are windows onto the garden. It's known to be undertaken by the Carracci family of painters. That's possibly Ludovico Carracci, quite probably Agostino Carracci, and definitely Annibale Carracci, who did the majority of the work. And for simplicity's sake, I'll mainly refer to Annibale when I talk about the artist. Here we have Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, top left, painted between 1508 to 1512. It's hard to see here, but you'll be familiar with the ignudi, the nudes, that sit in between the walls and the ceiling. Next to this, we have Raphael's Vatican Loggia. You can see the fictive panels of paintings and the painted balcony motif, making it look as if we have a view outside. Bottom left, we have the Stanza de Constantino, painted between 1508 and 1524. And the large picture on the right is the Carracci's Farnese Gallery ceiling. If you look closely, you'll see ignudi, fictive paintings, a painted balcony motif with a view outside. It's clearly influenced by these predecessors. The Farnese Gallery is one of the great fresco cycles in Italy. It was hugely influential, and once they'd seen it or heard about it, many patrons in Rome and beyond wanted a part of this work. A reproduction, a series of prints, new work by the same artist, new work by artists taught by the Carracci afterwards. It really was a career maker for those involved in the work. There's even an 18th century reproduction in North Yorkshire. That's how far its reputation travelled. But today, no one can agree on how we should read the ceiling. The general consensus is that it's a bunch of scenes not designed to be read in any particular way other than being random mythological scenes about the power of love. Many experts believe the scenes don't really connect with each other and could even be substituted for other general myth scenes on the loves of the gods. We don't have an early account of an exact reading of the ceiling. That's not unusual. We do have accounts of authors and art historians' favourite parts of the ceiling, and we have general praise for the ceiling, but full explanatory written documentation from the time just doesn't exist. We do have written accounts from half a century after it was completed. There are two biographers, Balori and Malvasia. The problem is, these two sources weren't even born in 1602 when the room was open to view, so they've been discounted, even discredited, because they're far removed in time from the artwork itself. So what do we do when we can't rely on the experts and we have to rely on ourselves? Well, our primary source material in interpreting the ceiling is the work itself and the preparatory drawings for it. But before we move on to that, I do want to draw your attention to a quote from one of those early biographers, Malvasia. He wrote of the work, "In the Farnese gallery, Agostino and Annibale, with their own brushes, augmented the marvels of Rome." And this seemingly unremarkable quote, I think, is the biggest clue to our interpretation, staring us in the faces, missed or ignored for almost half a century. But I didn't know that until I'd done my own critical thinking on the work. So, there's no spoilers here. I'll come back to the quote at the end. Let's now turn to the critical thinking bit. These are engravings of the gallery by Giovanni Volpato from 1775 to 1777. They're a useful resource for studying the scheme because they take the difficult perspectives away from photographing a domed, illusionistic ceiling and makes it easier for me to point things out. So let's start with the descriptive stage of critical questioning. Notice the background colour scheme of the slides now. They're grey to indicate the descriptive stage. Here's a reminder. So, the descriptive stage of critical questioning. What are we looking at here? The Farnese Gallery is considered to celebrate the power of love. Love conquers all. We're looking at the gallery walls, displaying statues from the Farnese collection, amongst little allegorical scenes, busts of great men from history, and devices or impressa. These are heraldic shields popular in the Renaissance, representing the virtues of the Farnese family. Odoardo Farnese's is 3 lilies and the motto, "With God's aid I grow." His core value represented in a shield and motto, like your family signet ring. The Carracci added to this with their fresco painting above the walls of fictive architecture, and they added the loves of the gods, fable, and fictive ornaments of Atalants and Ignudi. Who are we talking about when we talk about the Farnese Gallery? There's the artists and the patron who paid and directed the artists. So let's start with the money, the patron. The patron's important because the context within which someone decides to commission an artwork and the aesthetic tendencies or preferences of that patron are really significant factors when trying to establish what guided the patron and artist when they started a work of art. The patron for the Farnese Gallery was Cardinal Odoardo Farnese. He belonged to a family who were known for their strong support of the arts. Pope Paul III, his great-grandfather, had undertaken a huge project of urban planning and building. 16th century architecture in Rome was largely down to him, and that meant there was a history in the physical surroundings of the city for Odoardo, as well as in the family collection of artworks that he'd inherited. Pope Paul III favoured work in the style of classical Rome. Alessandro Farnese, shown here in the top left, was the grandson of Pope Paul III and Odoardo's father. He preferred the more trendy mannerist style of his time. He was a great patron of El Greco and commissioned decorative arts, medals, coins, bronzes, gems, miniatures, maiolica and metalwork. And he also owned paintings by Titian, Michelangelo and Raphael. The most precious items from his patronage are the Farnese Hours by Giulio Clovio, seen bottom left, and the Farnese Casket by Marino Sparri and Giovanni Bernardo da Castel Bolognese, in the picture next to it. And just note the figure sitting on top of the casket. That's Bacchus. Alessandro also increased his family's already notable collection of antique sculptures, bringing the best sculptors to live in the palace while they restored fragments of ancient statues from the collection. By the time Odoardo became Cardinal, the art collection was one of the most significant of 16th century Rome, as was the family name, and he was expected to carry on the tradition of patronage. Before commissioning the Farnese Gallery, Odoardo commissioned Annibale Carracci, the youngest of the Carracci, to fresco his Camerino, his private study, in 1595. The central scene chosen for the Camerino was the choice of Hercules, a choice between the tough path to virtue and the easy path of vice. In this work, seen here bottom right, Annibale is influenced by Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling, the Farnese Hercules, which is a statue in the Farnese collection, and the Laocoon, a touchstone work of sculpture unearthed in Rome in 1506. He's squaring up to the best artists of his day, Michelangelo, important pieces from the Farnese collection, the Farnese Hercules statue, and the most notable work in the entire history of art, the Laocoon, which is pretty bold. Annibale Carracci came from a family of artists from Bologna that became known for rescuing Italian art from the excesses of mannerism and the overstated realism of Caravaggio. You can see a work by El Greco, another by Caravaggio, and a self-portrait of Annibale Carracci, all top left. Odoardo Farnese wanted to move away from his father's mannerist tendencies of art collecting and build on and improve his great-grandfather's preference for classical Rome, so Annibale Carracci is the perfect match for him. In 17th century Rome, the Farnese Gallery was known to be Annibale's greatest work, but trends in more recent years have focused on his naturalistic genre paintings like the Bean Eaters and the Butcher's Shop we see here, and landscapes, which were greatly influenced by his older brother Agostino. They're seen as important precursors to those of Claude and Poussin, like the flight into Egypt shown here top right. The Carraccis founded an academy of drawing and painting in Bologna. Guido Reni and Domenichino were among their pupils. They were highly regarded artists who wanted to educate others about what art should be, what direction it should be taking. There was definitely an intellectual, theorising element to their academy. But back to the commission. Odoardo was commissioning the work for the Farnese Palace in Rome. Here is a mid-18th century engraving of Palazzo Farnese. And here's a more modern photo. Pope Paul III commissioned the building of the Farnese Palace in Rome when he was a cardinal, and work was carried on by Alessandro and Odoardo. It was designed by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger. Work was continued by Michelangelo and then by Vignola. It was completed by Giacomo della Porta, Michelangelo's student, following the designs left by Michelangelo. It's one of the best examples of high Renaissance architecture in the city. What you can't see from this photo is that there's an inner courtyard, which I'll show you next, and a secret garden at the back that once stretched all the way down to the Tiber, which the Farnese Gallery windows look out onto. A visitor to the Farnese Palace would be impressed from the moment they entered the courtyard, where they were immediately faced by the two colossal Farnese Hercules, a popular theme for Odoardo. You can see them here in the engraving top left. As he moved into the building and up to the first floor rooms, a space for invited guests, sculptures from the collection were arranged in a programmatic way so that the subjects would match those of the paintings in each room. Perhaps our earliest indication of Odoardo Farnese's interest in the paragone, which is the rivalry of painting and sculpture. The gallery itself was intended to be enjoyed by visitors leisurely walking through the space, having delightful but learned conversation. The engraving here is a little misleading because the first floor archways are actually on the top floor and the gallery is on the first floor, but it's nice to see the statues in situ and get a feel for the space. You can see it accurately in the photograph top right. Now, just to make clear, I've not even looked in detail at the work of the Farnese Gallery ceiling itself yet. I've merely considered why, who, and where. But this is absolutely an integral part of understanding the work itself and shouldn't be skipped when researching, because they offer significant clues already to how we should interpret the work. Let's move to the analysis stage. How and why does it look the way it does? The Carracci were known for their use of a technique called quadratura. You can see the painted effect of extending into an imaginary space beyond the confines of the actual wall or ceiling. An earlier masterpiece of quadratura is the famous Correggio's Assumption of the Virgin in Parma Cathedral from 1530, which is top left. The Carracci had used the technique themselves in previous palace frescoes in Bologna, at the Fava Palace in the 1580s, decorated with stories of Europa, Jason and Medea, middle left, and at the Magnani Palace in 1590 with stories from the founding of Rome, you see bottom left. You can really see that they've refined their technique in those 10 years. In the Farnese gallery, you can see that they've painted fictive paintings in fictive frames on the wall. These are quadri riportati, the plural for quadro riportato, which would refer to just one fictive frame. You can see that it's a much more complex quadratura design than their previous works. The Farnese gallery represents the pinnacle of this quadratura technique. Here are a few details to introduce you to the style and techniques used. The Carraccis had a theory that they taught in their academy. It was that the principle of using light in painting and the illusions of chiaroscuro were not simply an imitation of the appearance of nature, but of the activity of nature. So what this distinction means is, in the Farnese gallery, light is depicted in paint not only to form the appearance of objects and architecture, but it also describes the nature of these things, distinguishing fictive painting from sculpted form and figures from life against a background of fictive architecture. They're not just stepping away from mannerism by painting more truthfully, but they're also not restricting themselves to merely copying nature in a hyper-realistic way. They're playing with and exploring the parameters of art through illusion. The medallions look very much like shallow relief carvings when compared with the way the putti are lit, are glowing almost from within. But when you take the colour out, you can see how 3D they look, yet they're still not as soft and alive in the same way as the putti. Then we have petrified Phineas, transforming from human flesh to stone in front of our very eyes. He's looked into the eyes of the Medusa. His legs look softer and more fleshy than his hard torso, which is turning to stone. The skill displayed to model different surfaces in various and often contradicting levels of reality here is staggering. What you have with this highly evolved sense of form, playful illusion, paragone, is a three-layered vision. First, painted reality in terms of the architectural features. Second, painted fiction in the paintings. And third, painted fantasy with the ignudi, the atellants, coming to life, and the putti, the fantastical elements that are painted but are meant to be sculpture, but are actually coming to life in front of you, shivering from the cold, yawning at you, the viewer, peeing on the artwork. This detail and complexity was my first clue to our misunderstanding of the genius involved in this work, and gave me that first sense that each and every part of the work was significant and placed there for a reason. Many art historians who've published interpretations on this work may not agree, but I just don't think that you can have that attention to detail and then chuck the constituent parts together randomly with no reason behind it, especially when the work is hailed as one of the greatest artworks of its time, rivaling the Sistine ceiling and transforming Italian art. So here's a bit of advice from me to you. The moment you get an inkling that something doesn't add up with the current way art historians see something, that's not something to be ignored. Follow your gut. It may lead you to new interpretations. So let's look at the work in detail. Entering the gallery, the viewer would first be confronted by the colossal Polyphemus Innamorato on the short wall of the gallery. Even in the poetic guise of a pastoral lover, his size and physicality is quite monstrous, particularly when you combine it with its pair, Polyphemus Furioso, on the opposite short wall of the gallery. Here they are together, Polyphemus in love and in anger below. In Polyphemus Innamorato, there's a gentleness to his gesture as he plays the shepherd pipe. The preparatory drawings show Annibale reworking the hands in an effort to capture the perfect placement to represent the gracefulness. But his huge mountainous body swells out of the picture plane, almost onto the viewer below. You may know another work that does something similar, Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus, with that outstretched arm. Annibale is already playing with the tone, the drama, and with appearances here. Polyphemus is a cyclops. He's a savage, man-eating giant from the Odyssey, but here he's sweetly depicted in love with the sea nymph Galatea. In the poem by Theocritus that inspired this scene, he's a young herdsman, see his shepherd's crook. He's finding solace for his heartbreak, his unrequited love for Galatea through song. The poem by Theocritus is really concerned with the contrast of the elements of earth and water, keeping them apart. So we already have a reference to the theme of love and the idea of opposing forces, particularly those of earth and of water. In Polyphemus Furioso, we see the later incident when the Cyclops was spying on Galatea. He saw her in the arms of Acchis, her lover. In a jealous rage, he hurls a rock at Acchis, crushing him. Galatea eventually turns him into the spirit of the Sicilian river Acchis, as is characteristic of Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is where this story is derived from. It's important, if you can, to find the inspiration or models behind figures or scenes. It can tell you a lot about what the artist or patron valued, was influenced by, or wanted to refer to in some way, and provides clues as to what the intended effect would have been on viewers at the time. It's no coincidence that the Polyphemus recalls the Farnese Hercules, remember him from the courtyard, but similarities have also been noted between Polyphemus and the Farnese Boxer, another statue from the Farnese collection. It suggests that from our entrance into the gallery, we begin a kind of paragone, that rivalry or conversation between painting and sculpture, something that Odoardo Farnese so enjoyed and actively created in the Farnese Palace. Remember, he's already paired sculptures and paintings together on this floor of the palace. There are also allusions to Raphael's Polyphemus in the Farnesina, and to Pellegrino Tibaldi's Polyphemus, part of his illusionistic ceiling fresco masterpiece in the Palazzo Poggi in Bologna, commissioned by Cardinal Giovanni Poggi. So Annibale is actively in conversation with or competing with the great artists of the past, classical, Renaissance and Mannerist alike, as usual for Annibale really. So here we're looking straight up at the ceiling, as if we were lying down on the floor. We've just seen both short walls with the Polyphemus scenes, and we're going to look at the long walls next. Notice how each fictive painting is paired with a medallion. They're the green-tinged circular scenes. We start with Hercules and Iole, highlighted here. So we're looking at what we've got, the description part of our critical thinking process, and asking why do we see it that way and not some other way, which is the analysis part of it. Hercules and Iole is a tale of love's victory over the strong. Hercules wanted to marry Iole, but her father refused the match. Instead, he promised his daughter to whoever could beat him and his sons in an archery contest. Notice the Cupid with the bow in the top left corner of the fictive painting, the Quadra Riportato. So, undeterred, Hercules enters the competition and wins. Her father still denies him. Hercules spots another beautiful woman and marries her instead. But then he goes back to seek revenge on the broken promise. He kills Iole's father, brothers, relatives, and takes her captive to be his mistress. In Ovid's account, Hercules is desperate to win back Iole's respect. After killing her entire family, how he thinks this is possible, I don't know, but he's desperate to impress her. She convinces the not very bright Hercules that the way back to her heart is to do as she asks, and she asks him to dress like a woman and act the part of a mistress while she wears his clothes and carries his club. This is intended to disgrace the great warrior and egotistical hero Hercules in front of his family and friends, and in so doing avenge her father's death in the only way that she can. So here we see him wearing jewellery and playing the tambourine. Interestingly, that's a departure from Ovid's spindle turning or working the loom. Knowing the source of the tale is important so you can highlight where the artist improvises on it. The choice of the tambourine emphasises the musicality that's already within the gallery scheme with Polyphemus's shepherd pipes, and music becomes a theme throughout the fresco, so it would seem this divergence has a significant purpose. You can also see this gender power play in the postures of Hercules and Iole. He's in a traditionally feminine pose as he looks submissively into Iole's strong gaze. You've also got the typical sexualised fruit swag. You can see split figs and courgettes, the Renaissance equivalent of the aubergine emoji, beneath the picture. Iole's whole family has been slaughtered, so while she has conquered Hercules, ultimately Cupid wins this archery contest for creating Hercules' ridiculous infatuations. And that's another message we'll see running through the gallery. Love, Cupid with his bow, conquers all. The medallion scene paired with Hercules and Iole depicts Hero and Leander. Theirs was reciprocal love. Leander used to swim across the waters at night to meet his lover Hero. She would guide him by torchlight. One night, during a storm, the light went out and Leander was drowned. In another divergence from the original tale, here we see the scene embellished with Cupid lighting the way for Leander, reminding us that without the aid of heavenly love, represented by Cupid, and there'll be more on this later, earthly or appetitive desires don't end well. At this point, it's probably useful to remind you of Odoardo Farnese's Impressa motto, with God's aid I grow. You can't do it on your own. You need the gods on your side too. God, or Cupid Eros, as heavenly love, not earthly love, more commonly known as lust. We'll move now from Hercules to Venus and Anchises, as if we were reading a triptych. The story of Venus and Anchises here is twofold. It describes the power of love, which not even Venus herself can escape, but it also represents the glory of Rome and, by association, of the Farnese family. The story comes from the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. Under the effects of her son, Cupid, Venus falls in love with Anchises, a Trojan shepherd of Mount Ida. Disguising herself as a mortal, they make a baby called Aeneas, the legendary ancestor of the Romans. Cupid proudly presents us with his triumph and plants his foot on a golden stool inscribed with the motto from Virgil, which translates as "Whence the Latin race," directing our interpretation of the scene. Remember that Aeneas sails up the river Tiber to found the site of Rome. This picture is on the window wall that looks out onto the river Tiber. Its placement is deliberate. It is certainly deliberate. The medallion scene paired with Venus and Anchises depicts Pan and Cupid, earthly, profane love, and sacred love. Cupid is subduing Pan, and Pan is kneeling on one knee, reminding us that sacred love reigns supreme. And here, with Venus and Anchises, bears the finest fruit, namely the founding of Rome. Moving from Hercules and Iole to Venus and Anchises, we now move to the larger central scene on the wall, reading it like a triptych. I think you could read the Polyphemus scenes together, and likewise you would read this central scene together with its pair on the opposite side. I'll admit there could be some flexibility to the general order of reading these scenes, save a few key panels, but you certainly couldn't swap the panels around or move them to a different part of the ceiling, or replace them with something else. Consider this like a single painting. You can look at the different elements in a different order, but you couldn't move one element to another place in the composition and not have it affect the work. Remember, this is a space for milling around, walking and conversing, discussing what you see, showing off your learning and how you can pick the sources of these scenes and offer interpretations to the morals. Here I just want to show you how important it is to be critical about things you find online. Imagine you're looking for an image of the artwork you're studying, and imagine it's this scene. Can you spot the difference between these two images of the same work? The top one is from the Web Gallery of Art, and the bottom one is from Getty Images. Can you spot it? Look at the medallions. The Getty have probably taken lots of photos of the ceiling and pieced bits together to create scenes, and they've pieced them together incorrectly. Accidentally, I'm sure, but incorrectly nonetheless. You'll have noticed how, so far, the medallions help direct your interpretation of the scene it's paired with in relation to whether the scene is of heavenly love or earthly lust. One set of medallions here is designed to make you see the paired quadra riportato as an example of divine love, an apotheosis, the elevation of a mortal to divine status. And the other one is designed to make you interpret it as earthly love. That is a big difference when you're considering morality and love as the key theme. So you can see why it's key to assess your sources, where possible to see the work in person and to always be very critical. So here we see the story of Aurora and Cephalus. In myth, Aurora, the goddess of the dawn, renews herself every morning and flies across the sky, announcing the arrival of the sun. A bit of backstory: she fell in love with Tithonus, a mortal, and wanting to be with him forever, she asked Jupiter to grant him immortality. But she forgot to ask for eternal youth, and so he was immortal, but he just got older and older. The interpretation of the myth chosen here is taken from a poem in one of the first ever Italian operas. It's another musical reference a visitor could comment on to demonstrate how intellectual and cultured they were. Aurora has been struck by Cupid and has fallen in love at first sight with the young, mortal Cephalus. Her infatuation leads her to neglect her duty of heralding the day. Phoebus, the sun god, cannot rise from the ocean, personified by the god Oceanus, without her, and night is forced to remain in the heavens, which threatens the earth with chaos and destruction. Interestingly, this is only a few years before Kepler, in 1605, published a scientific description of a total solar eclipse, which is essentially what the myth refers to rather unscientifically. Despite Cephalus's rejection and declarations of loyalty to his wife, Aurora persists. Cupid agrees to help Aurora, and the story concludes with her taking Cephalus up to heaven, another apotheosis. But the apotheosis is not the part of the narrative depicted here. It's the earlier moment when Aurora abandons her duty and the natural order of the day is disrupted. Why? Why do we see the beginning of the story and not the end with its connotations of being elevated to the heavens? As, spoiler alert, this would appropriately tie in with some of the later narrative scenes of apotheosis. This reading of the end of the narrative, with it symbolising the progress of the human soul towards God, wouldn't fit with the correctly identified lustful medallion scenes either side of it. Being lustful doesn't pair well with the moral state of being divine, so that added context is key. We're seeing the start of the tale, and that's the message that the natural order has been disrupted. So that's what we have here. And Aurora and Cephalus is to be read in conjunction with the painting on the opposite side of the vault. So let's see what we've got there. Let me start by saying that this scene has proved difficult to interpret. I won't go into detail. Our most plausible pairing is Tethys, the land, and Oceanus, a personification of the sea, alluded to in the previous scene, twin statues of whom stood in the Farnese palace courtyard, another possible paragone. Their tale is drawn from Ovid's creation myth at the beginning of the Metamorphosis, an influence already seen in the gallery too. Ovid describes a state of chaos that is resolved by the elements of land, poised in the enveloping air, balanced by its own weight, and the sea that stretches out its arms along the margins of the shore. The encircling sea took possession of the earth and held it in its embrace. It was a harmonious union that personified nature in balance. If we think back to the Polyphemus scenes, the message was one of love and the idea of opposing forces, particularly those of earth and water. And notice the placement of the quadriportato in the ceiling scheme, which suggests a four-piece pairing of the two Polyphemus, Aurora, and this scene. Let's have a look. You have the motif of opposing forces, the separateness of earth and water, from Polyphemus Inamorato, and also unrequited love, Polyphemus Furioso, and Aurora. You have chaos brought about by earthly desire, with Aurora, and order restored by a sacred union, with Oceanus. In contrast to the medallions of impure love that flank Aurora and Cephalus, the medallions that flank this scene represent divine love and elevated status. Order is restored through righteous love. So now we'll move on to Jupiter and Juno, and Diana and Endymion, both highlighted here. Opposite the scene of Venus and Anchises, who represent the founding of Rome, we have Jupiter and Juno, both a farcical tale of married love and another opportunity to promote the resilience and glory of Rome's founding. The story is derived from Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. Jupiter had forbidden the Olympian gods to interfere in the Trojan War, and as a result, the Trojans had begun to suffer heavy losses. Juno supported the Trojans, and so she decided to take Jupiter's eye off the ball so that the gods who favoured the Trojans could help and intervene to avoid their imminent defeat. In order to seduce her husband, she dresses up as another woman, Venus in fact, and in this disguise, she keeps him occupied long enough for the other gods to swing the war in favour of the Trojans. The decorative swags that accompany this scene include acorns from winter oak, which was sacred to Jupiter, and garlic bulbs, which Pliny's natural history explains have aphrodisiac qualities, but can also cause dimness of sight and flatulence. It's worth noting that this is the only scene in which there aren't any cupids. Juno wears Venus's girdle belt around her waist, which apparently is all it takes to confuse Jupiter about the woman in front of him. We know from the Aeneid that later on Aphrodite herself convinces Jupiter to intervene against the Trojans to redress the balance, and it's this that ensures Aeneas survives to found Rome. So love does conquer all in favour of Rome here too, despite the missing cupids. The fact that Aeneas is protected by Jupiter confirmed the Romans' belief that their empire was founded on divine authority. The medallion scene paired with this group is that of Apollo and Marsyas. Marsyas was one of the followers of Bacchus and was a proud pipe player. His pride in his skill on the pipes angered Apollo, who challenged him to a musical contest. Apollo played the lyre, the stringed handheld harp, the music of which was felt to be spiritually uplifting, compared to the pipes which were considered to stir the passions. The Muses were named as jury, and at first they couldn't decide who was better, but Apollo tricked Marsyas and was ultimately named victor. The medallion illustrates Marsyas' punishment for losing, getting flayed, skinned alive. The myth was interpreted allegorically as a spiritual purification, shedding the outer, sensual, vain self. There's also a moral judgment at play here, with being spiritually uplifting versus igniting the passions. Considered through the lens of Virgil's Aeneid, it also refers to the struggle within Aeneas between his emotions, mainly love in the story, and his commitment to his prophetic duty to found Rome. And you'll note there's the theme of music again. So we move now from blind love to divine insight. The final fictive wall quadroripotato, fictive painting, is that of Diana, daughter of Jupiter and goddess of the moon. According to myth, Diana saw Endymion, a handsome shepherd, asleep on a mountain top. She fell in love and visited him while he slept, night after night. In one version of the tale, Endymion was partly awoken from his sleep. He saw Diana, but believing the vision to be a beautiful dream, went back to sleep, wishing never to leave that beautiful dream again, and so was granted everlasting sleep. Diana eventually steals him away and hides him in a cave so no one can take him from her. It's often a tale interpreted as an allegory of platonic love and divine contemplation. Think Plato's cave, prisoners chained to the walls of a cave from birth, seeing shadows on the wall, and believing them to be reality, not seeing them for what they are, which is merely a reflection of the real world outside the cave. It's about the difference between sight and insight. This scene can also be read as an allegory about patronage and private consumption, seeing a beautiful artwork, or person, and stealing it away for one's own private collection. And that theme of divine contemplation and illumination is throughout the ceiling scheme. Think back to Polyphemus. He's a cyclops. He has one eye in the middle of his forehead. He loses his physical sight by being blind to a number of intangible truths about the nature of man. He's a bit of a fool, but in fact only truly sees afterwards. His physical sight blinds him to what is real. Through losing his physical sight, he's able to gain insight. The medallion that pairs it is of Europa and the bull, Zeus in disguise. It's fittingly another abduction story, an apotheosis that is interpreted as a sacred union that transports the soul out of the material world to the divine sphere. At this point, we move to the central two gift scenes with striking fictive frames. The Sphinx, depicted on the frame, was considered the holder of mysteries and the doorway to knowledge, and associated with the allegories of virtue against vice. Remember that Camerino of Hercules. Beginning with Pan and Diana, here we see the moon goddess in her role as patron of hunters. Diana is being enticed into the woods by Pan with the gift of a dewy fleece. It's a story from Virgil's Georgics. Pan's pine crown is more vivid than the pine of the wood, and his fleecy legs are more like wool than that of his goats. His gift of wool is lighter and softer than the clouds in the sky. The second gift scene depicts Mercury giving Paris the golden apple with which he must judge the most beautiful of three goddesses, Hera, also known as Juno, Athena, also known as Minerva, and Aphrodite, also known as Venus. In an attempt to bribe him, Hera, Juno, offered to make him king of Europe and Asia. Athena, Minerva, offered him wisdom and skill in war, and Aphrodite, Venus, offered him the world's most beautiful woman, a woman called Helen. Paris chose Aphrodite's offer of Helen, thus sparking the Trojan War. Hera, Juno, doesn't take the snub lightly, which is in part what leads to her interference. It's Aphrodite's son, Aeneas, who leads the surviving Trojans to modern-day Italy to found Rome. It's another reference to the founding of Rome, but also a reference to a choice, like the Camerino Hercules, reminding Odoardo Farnese of the rewards for choosing the virtuous path. They're complementary compositions. Pan entices Diana down to earth from the heavens. She's moving down from beyond the surface of the painting. See the diagonal sweeps. Mercury descends from heaven out of the picture plane. These are reminiscent of the mastery of form seen earlier in the first Polyphemus fresco, with Polyphemus's body swelling out of the picture plane. Pan's fleece is what the viewer's eye is drawn to. Is Mercury offering the golden apple to Paris or to the viewer? In recreating the experience rather than simply the scene, the viewer becomes the judge of beauty and truth. Will we choose sensual, mesmerising objects like Pan's beautiful fleece, or will we grow with God's aid, as Odoardo's heraldic impressor device motto urges, in a divine union of apotheosis? Will we, as in the Camerino fresco of the choice of Hercules, choose virtue over vice? I'm going to gloss over these for time's sake. The putti in the corner of the room on that fictive balcony further confirm our readings of the ceiling scenes and restate that important theme of divine illumination and insight. They add clarity to the moral that we're beginning to see. The central piece of the ceiling fresco is that of Bacchus and Ariadne. In Bacchus and Ariadne, we have a composition of two halves, or rather two triangles, like a sideways hourglass if you take a bird's eye view on the scene. You've got Bacchus and Ariadne, then Silenus, Venus with Cupid, and the front of the cortege. A dancing figure, a Maenad, with a tambourine is poised in between those two triangles. Bacchus, Silenus, Venus with Cupid, and Ariadne are all popular figures from myth and have been used as metaphors for many different purposes. This is something that a 17th century artist, patron, and viewer would be very familiar with. Us, not so much. So what kind of interpretation was intended by representing this combination of figures? Typically, art historians have struggled here because Bacchus is not usually considered an appropriate subject for a cardinal. He's a little too pagan, a little too associated with drunkenness to be deemed suitable for a religious man. And they're right in many cases, but this is where their preconceptions and prejudgments cloud their vision. Don't forget Alessandro, Odoardo's father's commission of the Farnese casket that had a Bacchus on the top that I showed you at the start. And if I had more time, I'd show you a fresco in the Farnese Palace in a nearby room, commissioned by Pope Paul III, Odoardo's great-grandfather, and a pope, no less, that glorifies the church using the theme of Bacchus and Silenus on a donkey. So yes, it's unusual, and your experience would say that's not right, but the Farnese family don't conform to other patrons. Our descriptive research shows us that. So let's start by having a look at some examples from other artworks that use the same characters. There's the Silenus of Mantegna from 1470, bottom left, who, awakening from sleep, sings a beautiful song of creation, moving everyone to dance. He's crowned with a victory garland in recognition of his poetic gifts. or Michelangelo's 1496-1497 drunken and suggestive Bacchus, bottom centre, who looks from one angle to be lurching off balance, and from another to be graceful and perfectly poised, famously misunderstood as simply being a lewd, drunken god. Or Titian's apotheosis of Bacchus and Ariadne, who is immortalised as a constellation from around 1522 to 1523 in its bottom right. Or Guido Reni, a pupil of the Carracci, who painted reproductions of the Farnese gallery. His lost painting of Ariadne from around 1638 to 1640, right and centre, known only from a fragment, destroyed because its female nudes were considered too scandalous. The patron didn't think it was too scandalous at the time. It was only later audiences' perceptions of it that led to it being destroyed. Without any written evidence, we can't know for sure what sort of interpretation Annibale intended for his depiction of the figures. But when we don't immediately know how to interpret something like this, what can be useful is to look at other works commissioned by the patron or other defining works undertaken by the artist to compare with and find an interpretation of the work that matches what we do know about the artist or patron. As well as Pope Paul III's fresco and Alessandro Farnese's casket, we have a commission from Odoardo Farnese for Annibale Carracci, the Tazza Farnese, shown top right. While at work on the Farnese gallery, Annibale was also requested to undertake a commission by Odoardo to design a table ornament. It no longer survives, but its existence is recorded in 17th century inventories of the household, and there are a large number of preparatory drawings for the commission, as well as the engraving shown here held in the Met. This evidence tells us that the Tazza Farnese borrowed figures from the Bacchus and Ariadne scene. It's inspired by Virgil's Eclogue No. 6, in which Silenus makes wise revelations through drunkenness, another form of divine sight. There are 3 figures depicted, Silenus and 2 wine bearers. They stand in a complex composition in which each figure is connected within the group, all relying on each other for support, a little like the final pair of cupids under the victory garland a few slides back. They're interpreted in a Neoplatonic way. Yes, it's a slightly outdated thinking at the time, but Odoardo commissioned this after commissioning the Farnese ceiling, so we can't discount a Neoplatonic interpretation from the Farnese gallery Bacchus and Ariadne, however outdated we might think it is. In the Tazza Farnese, the figures recreate the triad of graces, considered to be a symbol of love and of God's power, which, to simplify the deep philosophical theorising, unfolds in an overflowing, produces a rapture, by which lower beings were drawn back to heaven to rejoin the gods in an apotheosis, which fits. Our figures of Bacchus, Silenus, Venus with Cupid, and Ariadne can be read as part of the allegory, with Bacchus and Silenus representing the giving or overflowing, Venus and Cupid representing the acceptance or rapture, and Ariadne representing the victorious return or apotheosis to heaven. So when we apply this here, we get a reading of Bacchus and Ariadne that importantly matches what we've seen in the rest of the gallery, something previous scholars have not managed to do. Amidst the noisy revelry of music and drunken celebrations, there are 3 striking gazes, that of Ariadne, the Cupid with Venus, and the figure with the sparagmus basket that alludes to the gruesome tale of Pentheus. He tried to spy on Bacchus. He thought of Bacchus not as a god, but as a man with drunken revellers who just liked to get naked and have a party. But obviously he was wrong, and instead, as a punishment for not believing in the heavenly divinity of Bacchus, he was torn limb from limb by frenzied partygoers. Pentheus is a symbol of warning against looking with the wrong perspective, with ill intentions. Ariadne, Cupid with Venus, and the figure with the basket form a trio that incorporates the viewer in the artist's scheme of giving, accepting, returning, overflowing, rapture, and apotheosis. In this depiction of the apotheosis of Ariadne, it's a Cupid and not Bacchus who crowns Ariadne with the stars of her constellation, a departure from the norm, but perfectly at home considering the theme here of the power of love or Cupid. While Bacchus stares blindly out of the picture plane, not at us like the other figures, but presumably in a wine-invoked moment of divine sight. The dancing figure with the tambourine represents the summoning of spiritual experience, so as a motif placed fairly centrally in the composition, she's also key to this interpretation of the scene. So it's clear that this is a celebration of the power of spiritual love to elevate the earthly to the divine, with a cautionary message about attempting to look with uninitiated, fraudulent eyes. If we return to the final medallion, that of Europa and the bull, we see that the decorative elements surrounding it are a little more overtly communicative than in other parts of the work. We have the putti, alluding to Michelangelo's creation of Adam, and in part to the artistic act of creating, and below this, the ignudi offer a clue to the appropriate reading of the gallery. One points to the dumbstruck amazement of the mask in the cornucopia, while the other points to a wall painting of Apollo and Mercury. Mercury, known for being a trickster, managed to steal some cattle from Apollo when Apollo was sidetracked by music. To cut a long story short, he was found out. The cattle were returned to Apollo, and Apollo and Mercury made up, having gained a mutual respect for each other's talents and interests. Gifts were exchanged, and a strong friendship began. Consider Odoardo Farnese as Apollo, in possession of a great many desirable sculptures. Annibale Carracci as Mercury, stealing his sculptures in a Paragone-type way by sort of plagiarising, but ultimately hoping to be admired by his master and to form a strong reciprocal bond between them. It's a self-reflexive moment that promotes artistic patronage as an elevating activity. Love and art can inflame the passions or elevate the soul. Annibale here shows that beauty can be coveted in art and in life, provided it's pursued in its capacity for rational and ethical development. Love has to be a union that is illuminating, reciprocal, not about power or conquest in order to be victorious love. The knowledgeable, those initiated into the mysteries of art and of life, can discern the truths from the fictions. Think here about the many layered realities in the gallery. It's more than a simple paragone. The Carracci's gallery champions the city of Rome, its founding and its artistic heritage, the Farnese family and its patronage of the arts, and lays down a challenge to viewers and artists alike to truly engage with, grapple with, and participate in art as more than mere decoration or artifice, remembering that the ultimate goal of art is that of the elevation of the mind and soul. There's a pertinent quote that I like. What a work of art represents is less important than what it transforms. It's in the subtle transformations of well-known scenes that the true message of the gallery becomes clear and the real mastery of the work can be understood. We're farther removed from that than the initial audience, and we often gloss over the details. When we look back at the earliest accounts of the gallery, we notice the little details of language that confirm this reading of the gallery, like Malvasier's comment. In the Farnese gallery, Agostino and Annibale, with their own brushes, augmented the marvels of Rome. He doesn't say they created another marvel of Rome, or they surpassed the marvels of Rome. He says, with their own brushes, they augmented, meaning they added to in order to elevate the marvels of Rome. So there is a message here. Coveting earthly beauty, whether it be for love or for art, can tame monsters, but ultimately leads to chaos, disrupting the rhythms of nature. Heavenly divine beauty, in the pursuit of virtue, can return it to a natural equilibrium, bringing order, and with God's aid, i.e. divine illumination, we grow. The work isn't just a very accomplished, technical collection of random fictive paintings and quadratura. It's a celebration of the heritage of Rome and the Farnese family, together with a reminder to Cardinal Odoardo Farnese to choose the path of virtue, as well as being a manifesto on what art should be, how it should be viewed, setting the Carracci's work within the canon of great historical works, and ultimately praising their vision for the future direction of art history. And it has just that result. It sets a new path for artists. The fact that we've lost sight of that is incredible and should be redressed. The thing with being an expert sometimes is, the more that you know, the more you bring that knowledge to bear on your topic, sometimes without really questioning it. That's when your predetermined ideas, your prejudices, your biases can lead you astray or lead you to miss things. Like in the instance of art historians misunderstanding the outwardly pagan, drunken Bacchus scene. But if you apply yourself diligently to the evidence, the artwork, and remember these 3 stages, you're more likely to get a more accurate interpretation of an artwork. If I hadn't started with the descriptive stage of background and context, I wouldn't have been able to relate the work to the family history, the artistic heritage, the paragony of sculpture, and of how Odoardo wanted people to experience his palace and his art collection. Without analysing the methods and processes, I wouldn't have understood the Carracci's views on quadratura and imitating nature that's so key to understanding the work's important message about art. I wouldn't have understood the reasons behind choosing certain scenes from stories over others, and the significance this has on the interpretation of the individual quadri reportati, and ultimately the whole work. You couldn't swap one of the quadri reportato without losing the comparison between its paired painting or medallion. If I'd only read academic articles and books, secondary source material about this work of art, and relied on the experts without additionally critically thinking about what I was reading and what I was seeing, I'd still think it was a random selection of nicely painted scenes about love. But from the evaluative stage, I hope you can all see how important it is to challenge that kind of codependent reading to something more grounded in your own critical thinking. These might seem like simple things to do, but what they can lead you to is far from a basic understanding of an artwork. At this point, I'd like to thank you for listening through to the end. That was a lot of information. And I'd also urge you to take a second look at an artwork that piques your interest or an artwork you love, just to see what might be lying in the contextual background given a renewed critical examination. So give it a go. Thank you for listening.